So that is the beginning of a conversation I would like to have and bring a panel up right now of people I have pre-selected who include Darla and Dr. Flemming and Dr. Marchuk and Dr. Smith. Yes, come on up, and we will start to talk about some of the bigger issues. They're up here for window dressing. Really, sorry guys, you're okay. Maybe a little more than that. What I really would like is for representatives from every group in the room, patients, clinicians, industry, researchers, to weigh in. The microphone can come around to you. Is there someone holding a microphone out there? The microphone can come around, or if you would like to step up to the microphone, that works too. And we have some serious things to talk about. And the first one is not so much out of these surveys, but it is the result of questions that or conversations I've had over the last couple of years, which is, what is the role of basic research, basic science going forward? And the big question there is, what is fundable? And are there fundable things that also happen to be relevant? And I think this is where I'm going to first defer to Doug, and you can start that conversation off, and then people like Brent can step up and go to the mic, because I know he's got plenty to say there. And others can follow.
So, you want me? So I'll tackle that one. What is the role of basic science going forward? I think that we're at a transition point where maybe it's time to start really thinking about building on what we already know. I think there's still a role for asking basic questions, but I think we know enough to move forward toward translation into the clinic, so drugs, in other words, and treatments. I still think there's a role for basic science and understanding, well, what do the CCM proteins do? But I think we know enough to move forward. What is fundable and relevant? That's a harder one. I think the thing about the gene therapy sort of lukewarm attitude toward that is interesting, because that's kind of something that the funding agencies, I think, oh, that's really interesting and new and novel and sexy, and so they want to fund that. I think the drug companies are going to have to fund the drug studies.
Brent, come to the microphone, please. Sorry. I'll bring the mic. There's a question on the side, though. Run.
That's the first exercise I've done in 4 days.
He gets sweaty and tired. Do that.
Yeah, okay.
And for patients who don't know, Doug Marchuk is the chair of our scientific advisory board, and Brent Derry is the vice chair. So we left him on the floor because we knew he could start conversations from down there.
So basic science has a lot of work to do. I think Doug's right. How do we choose the best drug? And that's a struggle, I think, because our animal models have some limitations. And I think collectively we can come up with maybe even combinatorial approaches. There might be a combination of, say, Tempol and other compounds that really improve lesion dynamics. But I think we also have to think about comorbidities. CCM3, very different beast than CCM1, 2. And I think there's a lot of work to do on that, especially therapeutically. Just my 2 cents.
I might add, as sort of someone that bridges the gap between super smart scientist people and regular clinicians, but I think one of the important things that is probably fundable and very important for this gap between the basic science and the treatments are this idea of theranostics, looking at biomarkers, looking at ways to measure when you have mechanisms from the basic science that you're trying to target. How do you measure their effect? How do you know that it's going to be, a response that you want? And I think this idea of using biomarkers as a tool to predict who's at risk and also to measure the outcome, not just in a general sense, but very specifically when you're using basic science to target a specific mechanism, how are you affecting those enzymes, those proteins, those molecules? And so I think that that's an area that now is sort of coming into its own and is a very exciting area to say, not just what drugs are we going to use to, or medicines to target things or gene therapies, but how do we measure their effects in a very specific way so we know that we're actually doing what we think we are. So I would put that as another area that sort of, I think, is exciting and developing now.
And even, the biomarkers that Dr. Awad and Gerard are looking at is can we predict who is going to have a hemorrhage? Right. And therefore, then those are the people that are at the highest risk, and we can target and probably are more willing to accept some of those IV infusions or the side effects. And so if we can predict those patients, that's going to have a higher yield, I think.
There was a question over there, and if you...
This is a question for Connie. I don't know what comorbidity is.
Comorbidity is when there is a second disease. As was mentioned by Billy, she mentioned that she was diagnosed with 3 different diseases. So it could be that somebody has another disease, and we wonder whether or not that is related to the primary diagnosis, which is, for everybody in this room, CCM.
So it's, you have multiple diseases.
Right.
Not just one.
Or conditions, yeah.
Okay. And then this statement is for Connie also. I had my CM surgery in 2002. It left me quadriplegic. I only could communicate with my eyes, looking left for yes and looking right for no. And my mom looked up everything about my disease, my syndrome, and she found your website. And to know how big you've come, that's just mind-blowing.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Anybody can answer, but as far as gene therapy goes, what are we hoping is going to happen with gene therapy? Are we hoping that if we change the gene, the CCMs will go away, the ones that we already have? Or are we just trying to stop more? That is a question that I know that a lot of people I know are asking.
And that one Doug can answer.
Yeah, so we're just starting a study for gene therapy in our mice, though, okay? So this is all in the mice, and we're addressing both of those questions. So some of the mice will be determining whether we can make the lesions disappear, to melt away. But in other mice, and without the details, but that's the goal. And then the other set of mice will be trying to treat the mice very early and stop the lesions from, the CCMs from ever starting. So we'll address both questions. What do we hope? We hope, of course, that they'll melt them away. I don't know, but even the outcome of only stopping them from new ones from growing would be good. And so we'll measure all of those. We'll also measure in the mice whether the lesions bleed or not. So we may not be able to stop them from growing even, but they won't bleed anymore. And then we'll know that too. And then the final thing is, as Dr. Smith said, is that we're going to be looking at biomarkers. Dr. Awad will be doing that for our mice, like he does for our humans, and we'll be looking to see if we can predict the outcome based on these, taking the blood of the mice and seeing whether there are markers in there that we can see have an effect.
And off of that question about gene therapy, just brings me to, like, with the survey, it was very striking to see the differences between the scientists, the clinicians, and the patients, particularly something like surgeons are very in favor of lifestyle changes and patients not as much. And then gene therapy is low on the list versus high on the list. And I think a lot of this comes down to communication outside of these meetings, the kind of like year-round conversations, because patients with knowledge are going to be the best advocates of what they want. But that back and forth lacks. So, like, as a scientist, as a clinician, how do we, and as a patient for others, how do you increase that throughout the year so that advocacy can start showing up in other places? Like in the clinical trials, oftentimes, like, the FDA wants to see hemorrhage because that's an easy endpoint. But if we want to move the endpoints, can we incorporate the survey questions to show to the FDA, be like, hey, this is what patients want, even though you don't love headache as an option here, can we get headache on this trial? Like, how does that interaction work outside of these meetings for like young researchers and scientists? Like, how do we communicate better?
There are like 5 different answers to your question. Several things. One is we had an FDA listening session where patients came and shared their priorities, and a lot of folks were like, I just want to feel better. I want my symptoms to decrease, and that's what's important to me. That could look like never having a hemorrhage again. We certainly don't want people to have hemorrhage again, but it could also look like I don't want to have a headache every day. And that could be something that is impacted by the same medicine that reduces the risk of hemorrhage. So we have educating at FDA to do. At the time that we did that education, FDA's neuro division was run by someone named Billy Dunn, who was very supportive of expanding, and that sort of filtered down. He is no longer there, so we may need to figure out a way to go back and do this again. Right now, I am actually encouraging any industry who is going into FDA to go over to the heart division, the cardio division of FDA, because they at this point are seeming more receptive. With clinical trials and participation, that's our job as a patient organization. We got a really amazing and just humbling response for the Recursion trial. But a big part of that was making sure that our patients knew it was there and understood what a clinical trial was. We created videos. We had the Clayton family videoing their day one and their screening appointment in order to show people this is what it means. It doesn't mean that you're going to wind up being a rat in a lab somewhere. You're going to go in and see a doctor and get an exam, et cetera, et cetera. We did videos about safety, et cetera. So when it comes time, if we are going to move forward with gene therapy, the role of the Alliance is to do the education. But what I don't know right now is how excited we should be at this time. And I think this is where Doug's work and Angela's work, those groups that are already working in gene therapy are going to need to lead the way for a while before we can gauge. And the field of gene therapy as a whole needs to, because every time there's a death of someone who was a recent recipient of gene therapy, that crashes patient confidence. And so if we can get past that point of patients dying.
If I could just add to that, because I think the studies of gene therapy are for the future and for perhaps the next generation. But as I pointed out, if we don't start now, we'll just be behind. So maybe that won't be something that's happening in the next 10 years, but we have to start now. And Chris Gibson gave that wonderful talk of how long it takes to get these things going. Gene therapy is even probably worse, so we need to start now in the mice.
I would just make a comment. My mentor was a gentleman named Mike Scott, and a really wonderful clinician. And one of the things he always emphasized was that, you know, scientists and some of people like me who are nerds, we're interested in curing the disease. But patients, they just want to cure their symptoms. They want to feel better. They don't want to have the nervousness of something bad happening. And I think that's probably one of the biggest disconnects, is that, you know, the scientists, the people with the PhDs that I talk to, they're way smarter than I am, and they're super excited about curing a disease, whereas the clinicians are more focused, and you saw that in the survey, where they want to the patients want to feel better. They don't want to be nervous about things. And I think going forward, one of the things that will be important, as you've done here a little bit, but I think we can do more, is aligning, when we talk about research and we talk about treatments, how the treatment of the disease is going to help the symptoms. And I think we do that a little bit, but I think increasingly that'll become more and more important, so that patients and scientists are aligned in what they want to do. So it's more of an education comment, I guess, in general.
Yeah. Darla, did you have any more?
Hi, I have a question about seizures. For the first 10 years after my hemorrhages, I did not have seizures except during my hemorrhages. Then about 10 years later, I started having seizures, and now my seizures are pretty bad. So I ask this question every year, and in the hopes that I'll get a different answer. Is there any research into a drug that will cross the blood-brain barrier and remove the hemosiderin stains, which are causing, I've been told, are the causes of my seizures now.
Yes. Different answer.
That is a difference.
Yeah, so it's very early, but we are talking with a company in Denmark that has a chelation agent that is in phase 2 trials for different indications, and we'll see what happens there. So, yay! But Darla has a little bit to add. Hold on, she's up here. She's more than just window dressing, really.
Sorry. I think Dr. Smith is absolutely right. We need to educate our patient population, which the Alliance is working to do. I feel like your study is going to give us the information to help educate our people about what gene therapy could do, and then I think people may get more excited about it at that point.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the things that you brought out, which was kind of low in the survey that I have questions about, and I'll just bring our oldest daughter, after her surgery several years ago, she went from production TV to being a nurse now, and now she works for a fertility clinic, which just brings me into the family planning piece that I also, having daughters with CCMs in the childbearing years and things, and how we look at, is there a way, and I guess I was first going to ask about gene therapy related to that, but I guess that's a total different thing. So I guess I'm not sure the exact questions, but how do they look at childbearing and trying to prevent the gene coming into that, or different ways?
Right. So at this moment, we have in vitro fertilization with diagnosis before implantation, and that's very risky for women with the disease because of the hormones involved. But Doug, did you want to comment on it's just an education moment for gene therapy relative to transmitting the disease to the next generation?
Right. So the gene therapy that I think will happen first, and that there's precedent in the other gene therapy trials, is just gene replacement. So we're not repairing the gene, we're just giving a new good copy back. If there's a bad copy, we'll give a good copy back, and we'll deliver that by a virus, maybe in the future, some other mechanism, like a nanoparticle or something. Okay, so the idea of repairing the gene is maybe a little bit more in the future, and maybe and you've heard of CRISPR and changes, and people have done things in animals, but I think what we're looking at so we're not thinking about changing the genome of the person, but just giving them a good copy back, and I think that's going to be a lot easier thing than repairing the genome, and so that's what we're thinking of.
I need to change. We're almost out of time, and I want to just make sure that we touch a little bit on that issue of pediatric research and treatment. And I think this is where there's an opportunity for industry if they start looking at this seriously. We have many, many, many children who are affected. Some of them have familial disease and are quite symptomatic, or have sporadic disease and are quite symptomatic, and you would be able to see what better is with these kids. And I know that there's special incentives with FDA to do pediatric trials. So Dr. Smith, would you like to comment on that?
Well, you're preaching the choir here. I mean, I'm a pediatric neurosurgeon, and I think it's a very easy point to make to anybody that has a child with CCM how important this is. I think the difficult thing is making people recognize that this is a relatively small population relevant to the adult groups. And I think personally, the two ways we've had some limited success in moving this forward have been, first, to sort of emphasize the general importance for kids, the fact that kids are the future, but also in a much more long-term view is, and this is very mercenary, but I think this is important, is the burden of cost and health care over the decades of the life of a child. And if you separate from the humanitarian, which I think is the most important thing as a physician, is simply the cost analysis of saying, if you can treat these children when they're younger, and you have had decades of healthcare costs and hospitalizations and drugs and therapy, and if you can obviate some of those costs, I think you can make a very compelling argument that it is worthwhile to invest the dollars early on because you're preventing this long-term burden, especially for the patient, most importantly. But if you're a mean, awful government official, and I apologize to any government or insurance people,
we let them out
but
this
if
year.
they look at it that way, I think that's a very compelling argument to make. We've done that with other pediatric diseases, and I think that's an opportunity here.
Yeah. We have 30 minutes allotted for break, so don't worry, y'all get a cup of coffee and be able to pee. We'll make sure. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for this. I have a question. I've noticed that so far there's been a focus on drugs and intervention, some of which is very invasive. My question is, we know that some type 2 diabetes and epilepsy sometimes can be reversed or ameliorated with an ancestral type of diet, ketogenic diet, focusing on whole foods. Is there any research or the research for drugs, do they take into account diet and nutrition so that to see if it can reverse or at least improve symptoms so that drugs become the last case scenario or used as a last resource? And in addition to nutrition, research focusing on diet and nutrition, research on neuroplasticity for people like probably most of us with a brain bleeds who may have lost certain things. Maybe there's neuroplasticity research related that to help improve quality of life.
Do you want to take on the microbiome question, Doug? There's two parts to the diet issue. One is the basic biology of the microbiome work that's been done, and then the other is the perhaps not yet started work on looking at what people actually eat and if people who eat certain things have different courses of the disease. I point at you because that's
Nutritional studies are very difficult, but very important. I agree with you. Is what else is there besides medications that I could do for myself to try to prevent this from happening? And it's a very important question. To my knowledge, I don't know that anyone's doing it yet, randomizing half of people to a emulsifier-free diet versus not. All of those studies, even when you look at when they've tried to do low-fat studies and they've targeted less than 30%, most people don't quite make the goals of those studies, and they're hard to control, unlike mice in a cage. But I agree. I think it's an important venue forward, looking at what else can we do. And I think the TLR4 inflammatory pathway is interesting in terms of what else triggers it, because I've read certain viruses can trigger the same pathway, and a lot of people have autoimmune diseases, and is there some relationship? And so I'd be interested in the basic science kind of answers to those kind of questions too in the future.
Yeah, so what we're all alluding to is the fact that in the mouse studies, there's clearly a role, perhaps not so much for the diet per se, but yes, through the diet, the microbiome, the bacteria that live in our gut, in our intestinal tract. So, and there's definitely a role for that. The question is, how do you translate that to the human studies? It's not clear. But yeah, but you're on the right track, because not that it would cure the disease, but it would really change the outcome, and it certainly does in the animals when you change the microbiome, the bacterial gut.
Helen has her hand up.
I haven't talked very loud.
Okay.
We are studying this in humans,
No.
familial am.
You won't be on the recording.
Oh, okay.
We're recording.
So we are studying the microbiome in the brain vascular malformation familial CCM study. I was going to talk about that a little bit later. We don't have any data to share yet, but one of the problems is getting people to submit their stool samples. It's not pretty. It's, that's how we measure the microbiome. So so those of you who are participating in the study, that's just a plug. That study has, we're not quite at the enrollment goals that we want for that study. And in humans, when we, unlike mice, you can't control everything in humans. So we're going to have much more variability, but we are also collecting a food frequency questionnaire, abbreviated one, to try and start to address that question of how important is this? Can we measure differences in humans with different diets and a microbiome?
So Dr. Kim will be talking to the patients this afternoon, and you can follow up with her on that. We are starting to really run short on time here now, because then you won't be able to pee. We have, okay, yes, please.
Well, I used to work at FDA, and good luck with those people. But I have a friend who still works for them and has offered to kind of be a resource. She's familiar
All right.
CCM and everything. So
Yeah,
what are the top?
let her put in a good word.
Well, what are the top 3 or 5 questions that I could have an informal conversation with her or people with that I think would be most important for?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What would the top, like maybe 3 to 5 questions be? Because she offered to have kind of an informal conversation with me and introduce me to people.
Oh, yeah.
Do you guys have a top list of questions that would be important to ask for people?
I would need more thought time than I have right now, but I could get back to you on my top 3. Is there anyone here who has a question for FDA that could be posed that needs? Okay, all right, Allison, we will get back to you. I'm going to have to shut down now. We can have more conversation in the patient meeting. You will be seeing some of these very same people in the patient meeting, and you can continue talking there. Some pieces of housekeeping. Talk to the scientists during break and lunch. Don't just sit with your families. You see them all the time. This is your one opportunity to see these scientists. Scientists have different colored badges from you. Theirs are maroon, burgundy, whatever you want to call that color. Yours are teal. So scientists, if you could please take the time to talk with some teal-colored people, that would be very good. And at 10:30, the patients will reconvene in the trade room, which is across the hall from Olay Restaurant. And then we will all meet again for lunch in Brickell, where the breakfast was. And thank you for a wonderful morning session. Chris, thank you again. All hail to you and the work that you're doing. And one last thank you is to the staff and the board members who have worked so hard to make this meeting happen. I cannot tell you how many hours go into this. So thank you. Enjoy your break.